Welcome to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Coming up, we'll review the week's top stories about the ongoing ComEd 4 trial in Chicago, upcoming court action about Illinois' gun ban, and more. I'll then join the Center Square executive editor Dan McCaleb to further discuss the news. That's ahead with Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop.
Between the Consumer Price Index, inflation, and job reports, it feels like you need a PhD in economics to fully understand the economic news happening around us every day. That's why you need the Everyday Economics Podcast. Join host Chris Krug and economist Dr. Orphe Devungi as they help you understand the economic world happening around you every day. Listen to the Everyday Economics Podcast at americastalking.com or wherever you get your podcast.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Here's some of the top stories from the past week. This week, Governor J.B. Pritzker said there are limits to the Second Amendment. Next week, he'll be defending that position in federal court. Wednesday, Pritzker said his gun and magazine ban is meant to curb gun violence.
There is a Second Amendment to the Constitution, but there are limits to what that means.
He enacted a ban on certain semi-automatic weapons and magazines on January 10th. The first lawsuit was filed in Crawford County by attorney Thomas Magg. That was then transferred to federal court and is now consolidated with 3 other cases, with the hearing set for Wednesday in East St. Louis. Magg said the state's arguments equating commonly owned rifles to hydrogen bombs is absurd.
It is so far out of the realm that I can't believe that a lawyer actually wrote it. I mean, that tells me the governor himself or the attorney general himself is just playing politics with this.
It's unclear when the judge would rule on a motion for a preliminary injunction. If one is issued, the law would be halted pending an expected appeal. The attorney for State Representative Dan Calkins, who's suing Illinois over the state's gun ban, has motioned for the Illinois Supreme Court justices that received political contributions from lead defendants in the case to recuse themselves. Before they were elected to the state's high court, then Justice candidates Mary O'Brien and Elizabeth Rochford received $1 million each from Governor J.B. Pritzker. They also each received 6-figure donations from House Speaker Emanuel Chris Welch. Now on the bench of 7, they're set to hear a challenge out of a Macon County case alleging the state's ban on certain semi-automatic weapons Welch passed and the governor signed is unconstitutional. Calkins' attorney, Jerry Stocks, filed a motion last week for the justices to recuse themselves because of unreasonably large campaign contributions from Pritzker and Welch that, quote, undermine public confidence. Asked in early March if the justices should recuse themselves because of the donations, Pritzker said that's, quote, ridiculous.
And these are independent judges, and they didn't go around and campaign on things, that they thought would win my support for them.
Stocks argues the justices did campaign on supporting a ban on semi-automatic weapons and high-capacity magazines. Beginning April 10th, the next phase of Governor J.B. Pritzker's gun and magazine ban kicks in. At an unrelated stop in Champaign Wednesday, Pritzker said his ban on certain semi-automatic firearms and magazines over certain capacities is to keep guns off the street.
There are certain guns that should not be available to the general public broadly, and you've seen that I believe I showed my own view about that, and the General Assembly showed its view on it.
Pritzker enacted the ban January 10th. The law says 90 days after enactment, gun owners can't possess prohibited guns or magazines in public unless they're unloaded in a closed case. Gun rights advocate Todd Vandermite argues the law includes prohibiting 15-round magazines that have removable base plates.
If we make it impossible for you to carry commonly used magazines with your carry gun, we kind of negate carry across the board.
The law faces a myriad of lawsuits in both state and federal courts, with the hearing in the Southern District of Illinois federal courts set for April 14th. And video evidence surfaced in the ComEd 4 trial showing defendants trying to rationalize utility contracts for associates of former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan that prosecutors say was part of a nearly decade-long bribery scheme. In one undercover video prosecutors presented to the jury, Fidel Marquez, who pleaded guilty in the alleged scheme and is cooperating with prosecutors, is having dinner with defendant Michael McLean. The topic was how to explain contracts for Madigan associates for little-to-do-nothing jobs paid for by ComEd.
It's a favor, and it's a Doherty contract, so Doherty's the one that has to prove if the IRS ever comes in and says, who are these guys and what do they do?
Right.
Doherty's got to prove it.
On February 13th, 2019, Marquez asked Jay Doherty what the associates do, to which Doherty said, not much. Doherty explained the deal.
Best just can be answered in Springfield with Madigan, and to keep Mike Madigan happy, I think it's worth it. I mean, just because you'd hear otherwise.
In a later exchange, Marquez's ComEd boss said the $400,000 contract makes sense to deploy Doherty's resources at the magic moment that could result in ComEd profits. Those are the top stories from the past week from Illinois. Find more at americastalking.com. Coming up for Illinois in Focus, I'll join the Center Square executive editor Dan McCaleb. This is Illinois in Focus, a production of America's Talking Network. I'm Greg Bishop.
Freedom and liberty are important to all of us in Illinois, from Rockford to Carbondale, from Quincy to Decatur. If you're looking for civil, intellectual conversations with those shaping the future of freedom, try the Future of Freedom podcast with me, Scott Bertrand. We speak with leaders across the country in the greater conservative and libertarian movements. In-depth conversations about where the next intellectual battles will happen across the country. It's the Future of Freedom podcast. Find it at americastalking.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello and welcome to Illinois in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McCaleb, executive editor of the Center Square Newswire service. Joining me today, as he does every week, is Greg Bishop, the Center Square's Illinois editor and senior Springfield reporter. How are you, Greg?
Dan, after some severe weather blowing through the past week or so, I'm glad I'm safe. Hopefully everybody else is able to clean up from the storms. But what a stormy week it has been.
It has been crazy, the weather here, and I hope it is gone because I am flying out tomorrow. My wife and I are going to visit our daughter in Texas at school for a long Easter weekend. Speaking of Easter, because of the weekend plans, we are recording this on Wednesday, April 5th, a day earlier than usual. It's also a day after the consolidated municipal elections in Illinois, and Chicagoans have voted in a new mayor, Greg. Cook County Commissioner and Teachers Union activist Brandon Johnson defeated former Chicago Public Schools CEO Paul Vallis. What do we know?
Yeah, and this is something that really came down to the wire, with polling suggesting that Vallis was in a lead, but not a comfortable lead. And as most of the votes came in late Tuesday after polls closed in Chicago, it turned out that Brandon Johnson did secure enough votes to become the next mayor. This after the February 28th primary, where there were 9 different candidates, and Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot not being able to make it past that primary. So Chicagoans knew they were going to get a new mayor. It was just a question of which of the two, Brandon Johnson or Paul Vallis, that would be. And with a 33% voter turnout, I think I saw, that's 1 in 3 registered voters actually sounding off on this election. Brandon Johnson accepted that election last night and said that he hears people and he will be a mayor for all of Chicago, even those who did not support his campaign. So Chicago is going to have a new mayor moving forward, and I think the difference between Vallis and Johnson is pretty clear. And as far as the support each candidate got, Johnson very much being supported by the teachers unions there, being a very progressive candidate. Vallis considered more of a moderate candidate, but Johnson he had a lot of support even from outside of Illinois. Bernie Sanders, an independent, a known Democratic socialist, supporting Johnson with a rally recently, and a lot of other support coming out for Johnson. And he did secure enough votes to be Chicago's next mayor.
Vallis was very gracious in his concession speech last night. But yeah, let's talk about now a little bit about Brandon Johnson, who will replace outgoing Mayor Lori Lightfoot, who was one of the candidates in that primary you referenced, but she finished third, so did not make yesterday's runoff election. Brandon Johnson, before this campaign, was a defund the police supporter, of course, with violent crime rising over the past several years in Chicago. That's a concern of his critics. He also has said that the wealthy should pay more in taxes. One of the other concerns in Chicago has been business flight from the city, with some businesses in recent months and the past couple of years moving out of Chicago. Tell us about his policies and what that could mean for Chicago, Greg.
Yeah, there's some concerns that if there's higher taxes and lax policies on crime, you could see a further exodus of not just people, but also businesses out of Chicago. So he's got a tall order ahead of him. It's not just the atmosphere in Chicago when it comes to business climate, when it comes to the crime climate. You've got Chicago finances that are still very much in a troubled spot. Plus, separate separate from what a lot of other areas outside of Chicago have separate city governments and separate school boards that operate independently from city governments. Chicago oversees the school district there. So that's something else that Johnson's going to have on his plate to contend with, and that is a school district with some schools that aren't performing as they should, high costs, and even a decrease in the overall student population there. So there's a lot at stake for Brandon Johnson as he gets ready to take the reins of Chicago. And, just a note, it wasn't just Chicago that had races. You had even here in Springfield, a mayoral race where the incumbent Jim Langfelder lost to Treasurer Misty Buscher. And even down here in Springfield, I think the voter turnout was close to 29%. So when you look at the voter turnout in these local races, rarely does it get over 35%, but it just shows that for some reason, voters don't turn out for these local municipal elections, even though these local municipal consolidated elections are of who's going to control that taxing body that's taking a significant chunk of the state's high property taxes.
And that's too bad. If a governor's race is not on the ballot, or of course U.S. presidential election, if that's not what's on the ballot, a majority of voters just tend to tune it out, and that is a shame because it is these local elections that have the biggest impact on things like the taxes that you pay, the services that you receive from the city or the county. Of course, school board were also on the ballot yesterday, and they have a significant say in, for example, the curriculum and teachers union contracts and that. So these elections are important. I don't know why it's the case, Greg, but voters just don't care, I guess.
It's quite baffling. There's no question, especially considering, the past 3 years with COVID policies being enforced locally, or even being opposed locally. You had school districts in Southern Illinois that were bucking the governor, and that was a local decision, a local control issue. So again, it's baffling that time and again we have very low voter turnout when it comes to these local municipal consolidated elections.
All right, Greg, thank you. Let's move on, though. We've talked about on Illinois in Focus, and you've reported in recent weeks about Governor Pritzker's $1 million donations last year to 2 Supreme Court justice candidates who won their elections and are now on the ballot. Some have asked for the 2 justices to recuse themselves from 2 high-profile cases that are currently before the Supreme Court, the cashless bail provision that was supposed to go into effect January 1st, but the Supreme Court shot that down after several challenges and is currently hearing that case. And then the new gun ban that Pritzker signed into law earlier this year. Well, on Friday of last week, Greg, you reported that a motion was filed in the gun ban case to have those 2 justices who received those $1 million donations from Governor Pritzker recuse themselves from it. Tell us more.
So there are different tracks of the challenges against Illinois' gun ban. You have the 4 federal cases in the Southern District that are consolidated. Those are set to be heard by the federal judge April 12th. So that's coming up. We'll definitely have the latest on that at thecentersquare.com as that's heard. You also have another Northern District of Illinois case out of McHenry County, some movement there where the state's attorney has sued the state in that case. But those are the federal cases. In the state level cases, of course, you've got the DeVore cases where there are temporary restraining orders preventing the state from enforcing the gun ban against named plaintiffs. But you also have a case out of Macon County from State Representative Dan Calkins. There was a final judgment issued in that Macon County case. And since the 5th District had already indicated that the case is likely to succeed on the merits challenging the equal protections claims here, that has now been immediately appealed to the Illinois Supreme Court. And as you said, 2 of the Supreme Court justices who were candidates last year, they each received $1 million from Governor J.B. Pritzker, $500,000 from his campaign fund, $500,000 from his trust, $1 million to each of these 2 candidates, Elizabeth Rochford and Mary O'Brien. Now, the question is, the governor and even the House Speaker, Emanuel Chris Welch, who gave six-figure contributions to these two candidates. They're lead defendants in this case. And people have raised the question, and we've even posed the question to the governor, should these Supreme Court justice candidates recuse themselves? When I asked the governor that in early March, he said it's ridiculous to consider that these justices have to recuse themselves. Well, it's no longer just members of the media asking the question. It's now Calkins's attorney motioning in the Illinois Supreme Court that these two justices recuse themselves. And ultimately, you have the motion laying out the campaign contributions to the justices' campaign funds. But it's not just that. You also have the assertion from the Calkins attorney saying that these justice candidates had support from gun control advocacy groups who say that these candidates voiced their support for banning certain types of weapons and magazines. So that's another element in this that is working into the Illinois Supreme Court. So a lot of questions still remain. The Illinois Supreme Court's going to hear that case sometime in mid-May. But before that, they're going to have to deal with this motion from Calkins's attorney to either have these two justices recuse themselves or have the court essentially say that they cannot take part in the gun ban case. The no cash bail case was already heard. They have taken that under advisement. Pritzker also a top defendant in that case as well. But we did not see those two justices recuse themselves during the hearing. They were still on the bench. Not sure if that's going to be something brought up. But with this official motion filed, it definitely makes the Supreme Court have to answer to this assertion of impropriety and bias.
And interestingly, the Illinois Supreme Court Chief Justice was before a House Appropriations Committee yesterday. Of course, the legislature is working on crafting a budget for the next fiscal year, and various groups go before the appropriations committees to make their pitch for how much money they say they need for the next fiscal year. But during that hearing, the Chief Justice, Mary Jane Tice, was asked about this recusal. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so the House Appropriations Committee yesterday on Tuesday, again, we're recording this on Wednesday, the 5th, but on Tuesday, they had an hours-long Appropriations Committee. They have multiple Appropriations Committees because there's just dozens and dozens of state agencies and separate constitutional bodies that need budgets. And the state legislature is the one that approves the budgets the governor ultimately enacts. So they heard from the Legislative Ethics Commission, they heard from the Legislative Audit Commission, a bunch of different other agencies, including the Illinois Supreme Court. Well, during the hearing, several questions about the court's operations, about the financing and the budget request they had. State Representative Brad Halbrook, a Republican from Shelbyville, he asked the Chief Justice, Mary Jane Tice, about the possibility these justices would recuse themselves. He said, will they do the right thing and recuse themselves from the gun ban challenge? And the Chief Justice gave, I think, what anybody would predict a Chief Justice would say with a pending motion out there, that she's not going to comment on this while that motion is pending. But interesting to see that posed in that official channel through an appropriations committee, that particular question, elevating it even more as a concern that a lot of people have about whether or not the justices can be impartial on this question.
Interesting. And of course, we'll continue to follow your very good coverage of this issue and more at thecentersquare.com. But let's move on to another story that you wrote about this week. You wrote a couple weeks ago about what some Republican members called shenanigans in terms of voting on various dozens, more than 100 pieces of legislation over the course of the last few weeks. On a Friday night, a couple of weeks ago, some Republicans called out Democrats who were not on the floor, but their names were being cast as votes, concerns that staff members were voting for elected officials. Well, now the Illinois Freedom Caucus is calling for an ethics investigation. What's going on here?
Yeah, and you did a good job recapping that where, it was late Friday night. It was bill deadline for the House. They had to get House bills out of the House by midnight that night. And the night before, they had gone up to midnight and passed 120 bills. The day before that, they passed like 110 bills. And after passing dozens and dozens of bills, it's about 9:30, it's about 9:45, and then they pass a controversial bill on standard debate. And that means only one person can stand in support and one person in opposition to have short debate. I should say short debate, not standard debate. But on short debate, only one in opposition and one in support. They had two Democrats stand up, one in support, and State Representative Anthony DeLuca, he stood up in opposition, though he ended up voting for the measure. And then Republicans, they demanded a verification. That was initially denied, which verification means they go through the roll call and they find if people are actually at their seats who are on the board as supporting something. About 20 minutes went by, and after the wrangling and the parliamentarians are, essentially saying you have to allow for a verification, they ended up letting the verification move forward, and Republicans found that there were 4 Democrats that weren't at their seat, including Anthony DeLuca. So he and the 3 others, they had their affirmative votes removed from the bill, enough to make it to where the bill didn't have enough votes to pass, and then they quickly ended session that Friday. Well, the following morning, shenanigans were called. State Representative Jed Davis from Newark, a Republican, he said this isn't right. These are tricks that are being played. It's beneath the voters for their representatives to leave the chamber and have staff vote on their behalf. So they're calling for an ethics investigation. And where that ethics investigation ultimately goes, not too sure here, but I did reach out to all 4 of the Democrats that were out of the chamber and had their votes removed from that particular bill. The only one that reached back out to me was Anthony DeLuca, the one who actually spoke on the bill and voted. And he told me he was there. He voted his own switch, but he then left. And in that 20 minutes from when the vote happened and when they had a verification, DeLuca was not on the floor. I did not get any response from the 3 other Democrats, Cam Buckner, Fred Crespo, or Anstava Murray. But the House Speaker's office did get me a statement about the Freedom Caucus's motion to have an ethics investigation into what happened. And their response out of the House Speaker's office is that the Freedom Caucus doesn't show any intent to actually govern, and they just want to obstruct. And it's Democrats, they say, are the ones that are going to be doing the people's business. So I don't think this is the last we've heard of this. And it's highlighting how what Jed Davis says isn't just shenanigans, but almost like a pressure campaign to, get people wore out as controversial legislation comes up, to just secure votes and get people to be like, okay, let's just hurry up and get out of here already. And we see that from time to time up against these deadlines, and especially at the tail end of session, which is coming mid-May. So I anticipate we'll see more of this back and forth and this debate on how exactly legislation is ultimately passed in the state of Illinois.
Interesting. And of course, listeners can catch all of Greg's coverage of this topic as well at thecentersquare.com. Greg, we have just a couple of minutes left. Time for one more story, an ongoing story, something we've talked about on Illinois in Focus the past few weeks, and that is the ongoing trial of the ComEd 4. Former high-ranking officials with ComEd and lobbyists for ComEd are on trial under accusations that they tried to bribe longtime former House Speaker Michael Madigan. Michael Madigan is not on trial during this time, but he is charged with more than 20 counts of corruption-related charges and will be on trial next year. Prosecutors are trying to build a case against the ComEd 4 that they gave no-work jobs and other perks in order to curry favor with Madigan so they could get legislation passed that's favorable to the utility. One of the new tidbits that came out this week during the trial is that business records were presented as evidence that show associates of Madigan were paid $4,000 to $5,000 a month through a utility company lobbyist for these no-work jobs. The trial currently in its 4th week. Interesting stuff, Greg, but that is all the time we have. Listeners can keep up with the ComEd 4 trial and all the stories we talked about today at thecentersquare.com. For Greg Bishop, I'm Dan McCaleb. Thank you for listening.